On this special episode of Movie Geeks United, the always enlightening and informative Ray Morton is going to be joining us to discuss the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture as we celebrate its 40th anniversary. Ray is the author of King Kong, The History of a Movie Icon from Fay Wray to Peter Jackson, which is my favorite book on the making of any of the King Kong films, and this one has them all. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Making of Steven Spielberg's classic film, is another one of his books. And Amadeus, Music on Film. He is a graduate of New York University and Pepperdine University, and Ray is a senior writer and columnist for Script Magazine and also works in Hollywood as a story consultant and script analyst. It's a pleasure to bring you back on the show for a third time.
Well, thank you for having me back. I love being on. Thank you so much.
Oh, we so enjoy it. We do. And so we're going to talk about Star Trek the Motion Picture. Like I said, it's been 40 years. That's hard for me to fathom and probably hard for you to fathom as well. And
absolutely.
It was, I remember very well the excitement about this film, the anticipation. It was very palpable in the air, even though in the days before we had the internet and all that, there was much talk about it and much discussion, and there were lines around the block when it came out. And I know I was in the Charlotte, North Carolina area growing up, and I can remember very clearly seeing the news clippings about all the people who were camped out to see this movie. So it's interesting to think about that, and you can imagine, I guess, the excitement when people hadn't seen these characters in really any live action format since 1969. So it was a 10-year.
Yeah, it was a movie literally 10 years in, maybe not in the making, then in the anticipating, and that I think that had a lot to do with why it opened so big, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so too. And so I think we'll just start with the genesis of the project and let you go into that. How it and I'm using genesis, of course, which is a word familiar to most Star Trek fans. So pardon the pun.
Yes,
but
it's hard to avoid.
Exactly. But we will go into. I'll let you go into how this project came about.
Well, it's really interesting because it's got this very complicated history, which I'll try to make as brief as possible. But basically, Star Trek went off the air in '69, and it was not considered a success on the network. But then it went into syndication almost immediately. I think it was a year. I think it went on in like 1970. So, of course, that's when it became a hit. People were watching it. It was on at dinner time, you know, as opposed to 10 o'clock at night, which I think was its last time slot. So kids could watch it and younger people could watch it. So it became this incredible syndication phenomenon, and then the fandom grew up, the conventions grew up. So it was a very big deal pop culture-wise. They did an animated series, I think it was in '73, which kind of kept the idea alive a little bit. And Roddenberry was involved in that, Gene Roddenberry, the Star Trek creator, and Dorothy Fontana, who was one of the writer-producers of the series. So it had sort of a legitimacy to it, and that kept it alive, but I think there's only a few episodes of that. So the fans were really eager for something. So about 1975, Paramount started to think that maybe they could do a low-budget Star Trek movie to capitalize on all of this success that it was having, this fame. Apparently, Gene Roddenberry himself had actually pitched a prequel film while the show was still in production, but that never went anywhere. So really, 1975 is the beginning of the project. So they hired Roddenberry. They basically gave him an office, and they paid him to write a Star Trek script. And he wrote, it's infamously become known as The God Thing, although that was not the original title of the script. And it was basically, it has similarities to the motion picture. This mysterious alien machine shows up over the earth and people start getting visions about God coming back, and each culture has their own version of God. And then what you end up finding out is that the machine was some sort of intelligence that got stuck. It's hard to describe, like stuck in God mode, and was really an alien imposter that was trying to take over the world or the universe. And so it's really a monster. So Roddenberry's idea was God was really a monster. And allegedly it ended with a fist fight between Kirk and Jesus on the deck of the Enterprise. So I suspect that may be apocryphal.
Wow.
Anyway, yeah, Paramount didn't care for that script, so then they basically told Gene he could write another one, and he started writing another script with his assistant, a guy named John Poville, who later became the associate producer of the film. And while they were working on theirs, Paramount also brought in a whole bunch of other science fiction and television writers. They basically tried to get everybody to pitch ideas, and that didn't end up going anywhere. Gene's second version was also not accepted, although legendarily it's sort of a time travel story in which the Enterprise gets sent back in time to the period of JFK's assassination, and somehow they prevent the assassination from happening, and then that screws up the future in some terrible way. And the apocryphal thing that you'll hear people say is, so the movie had to end with Spock shooting JFK in order to put history right. That's not quite what happened in it, but basically they actually bring JFK to the Enterprise, and he has to make the decision to go back and be at Dallas himself. So he's going to sacrifice himself. That was the ending of that script. Paramount didn't like that either, but why that was important was Gene kept bringing that story back for every movie that followed after the motion picture. So, it lived on in its own strange way. Anyway, so finally about 1976, Paramount brought in a new producer, a guy named Jerry Eisenberg, and Gene was going to be on it as a producer as well, but this guy Jerry Eisenberg was the guy who was tasked with getting the film put together. So he brought in the two writers of Don't Look Now, the famous Nicholas Roeg film. Right. I think it's Chris Bryant and Alan Scott, right? And they worked for a year on a script. Yeah, they worked on a year with a script, and eventually Phil Kaufman was brought in to direct. This was after he did The White Dawn, and I believe it was the Great Minnesota Raid, but before he had done Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So they had come up with this concept to do a story in which the Enterprise goes back in time and to fight like an alien race that's trying to mess with the development of the human race. And again, another time travel thing that kind of ends up with the Enterprise being the people who essentially get humans started in their development. So kind of 2001 meets Star Trek. And that was in pretty active development. The script went through a number of drafts, and then Kaufman himself took a turn at it. And that was in production pre-production until about April of 1977. And here's where the irony of all this starts to kick in. Paramount got wind that Star Wars was coming out. And they figured, and this is the famous line some executives said, they figured that there'd only be enough market for one science fiction movie. So they decided that they were not going to go ahead with that Star Wars had essentially beat them to the marketplace. And the famous line from some executive was, "There's no future in science fiction," which is just very funny.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So the project was canceled, and then Barry Diller was running Paramount at the time, and he decided that there were 3 networks at that time, and he decided that he wanted to do a 4th network, kind of what he later ended up doing at Fox when he went over to 20th Century Fox in the 80s. And they put together a collection of stations across the country, and it was going to be called something like the Paramount Network. And their idea was they were going to do a one night of programming a week to start. It was going to be a 1-hour television show and then a 2-hour original TV movie. And they decided that the 1-hour television show would be a revival of Star Trek, because they decided, all right, Star Wars beat us to the theater, so we're not going to do that, but we'll revive it as a TV show. So Jerry Eisenberg and Phil Kaufman left. Roddenberry came on board to produce the show. he and the studio brought in a writer-producer named Harold Livingston, who had done a lot of TV at that time, and then a couple of other folks. And they got started putting together, I believe it was 12 episodes for this first season of this show. And the pilot of that was a script called In Thy Image. And it was a story written by Alan Dean Foster, who was a famous science fiction writer. He wrote the Star Trek animated series novelizations in the 70s, and he's also famously the guy who wrote the Star Wars novelization that was published under George Lucas's name. And so he was brought in, and he wrote this story called In Thy Image, which is basically the story of Star Trek the Motion Picture. An alien probe is heading its way towards Earth, and the Enterprise goes out to meet it and discovers that it's a living machine, and then they have to do battle with it to save the Earth. Well, the thought was they were going to create that as a 2-hour TV movie to kick off the series, which was kind of common in those days. And so work was beginning on that. At the same time, Star Wars had come out and was a big hit. Over the course of that summer, while Star Wars was being bigger and bigger and bigger, the Paramount Network idea fell apart because they couldn't sell enough advertising to make it a worthwhile venture. So those two things happened, and Paramount started to think about, what are we going to do with all this money that we've invested in this Star Trek series that now isn't going to become a series? So they started thinking about making the 2-hour pilot into a low-budget movie, so kind of right back where they started in 75, and releasing it in Europe theatrically and perhaps in the U.S. theatrically, perhaps just making it a TV movie. They kind of weren't sure, and as they were making their deliberations, Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in November of 77, and all of a sudden there was a future for science fiction because that movie was a big hit, and suddenly Star Wars was not one-off, it was the beginning of a trend, and at that point, Michael Eisner and Paramount decided they were going to make Star Trek as a movie. That's how the project got started.
Wow, that's very interesting. I knew it had a complicated path, a twisty path, getting from where they had originally envisioned it until where it wound up. And I think that's very interesting that Barry Diller had the foresight to create a network so many years before it became such a commonplace thing, especially nowadays with all the streaming networks that are popping up left and right.
Sure.
He was way ahead of the curve and using one of the Paramount properties to entice people to tune in. So that was... Yeah, that's pretty amazing when you think about that from a 1970s perspective. So, yeah.
Well, it also kind of shows you the convoluted way a lot of these things happen. You know, nothing's just straight line apparently. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's this is very true. It's an excellent point. Now, I wanted to get into the production a little bit. I know there were a lot of technical challenges and things of that nature, but just wanted to get into it when it went into production, how long the length of the production, and those types of things.
They got started. I guess the decision was made to turn it into a feature in the end of 1977. So as they started to come into 1978, they started to rethink In Thy Image as a movie, and they had everybody signed to TV contracts, all of the original cast, and they had actually already cast Persis Khambatta, who played Ilea in the film. Ilea was going to be a character on the show, so she was already cast. So mostly they were ready to go because there's not that many other characters. The only person that ended up getting cast solely for the film was Stephen Collins, who played Decker, and he was not cast till quite some time later. So basically, early 1978, the production of the movie went on 2 tracks. There was the actual movie itself, and that was, they had to do a lot of rewriting on the script, and the rewriting of the script on Star Trek is a story all by itself. Basically, they went through several different writers, and for different reasons, it didn't work out. Harold Livingston had written the script for the In Thy Image pilot. Alan Dean Foster had written the story. Harold Livingston wrote the script. And then when it was put aside, the show was not going to go on. Harold Livingston and Gene Roddenberry did not get along. Harold Livingston did not think Gene was a good writer, and he didn't really like him personally. They started off as friends. They didn't end up as friends. So once the series was canceled, Livingston went off to work on other projects. So they had brought in a couple of other writers, and that didn't work out. So eventually, Paramount was looking. They had a TV director, a guy named Bob Collins. He was going to direct the pilot. And when the movie was low budget, he was going to direct the movie. But then the thing that gave impetus to the project was Star Wars and Close Encounters. And once Paramount and Roddenberry and everyone involved got a look at the visual effects in those two movies, they realized they couldn't really do a low-budget Star Trek movie, that audiences weren't going to tolerate low-budget special effects. They were going to have to go big. And because of that, the budget was going to have to be bigger. And at that point, they didn't want to use a TV director. So Bob Collins was shown the door. And Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was working on it, the executive, he had the idea to bring in Robert Weiss. And Robert Weiss at that time was a really heavy-hitting director. He was a big deal. And, of course, his science fiction credentials are impeccable. The man directed, The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is pretty awesome. And
oh, yeah.
And also, and had directed the Andromeda Strain a few years prior to Star Trek. So that was, another really good science fiction film. Anyway, Robert Weiss was brought in. Once he was brought in, the whole movie basically went on an upgrade. They brought back Harold Livingston to work on the script because they felt that they needed the original writer to really bring it home, because the other writers had gone off in a couple of pretty bizarre directions. One of the writers recharacterized Sulu as a guy who had his legs cut off in an accident, and he was rolling around in an automated. It wasn't really quite a wheelchair. It was like a kind of a shopping cart that he was attached to. It was very strange. But,
wow.
So it was going in a lot of directions. So they brought back Harold Livingston, and basically he and Gene fought for the entire making of the movie, because Livingston would write, and then when he went to turn it into Robert Weiss or to the studio, Gene would rewrite him and present his pages, and the studio didn't like Gene's pages because Gene really wasn't that good a writer. So, he did this a lot. Harold Livingston would get mad and quit, and then Paramount would bring him back at an increased salary. And this went on and on and on through pre-production and actually all through production. The script was never fixed. The first two acts were roughly there. They did not have an ending when they entered production. So anyway, the script was being rewritten. They had to upgrade all the sets because the sets had been built for television. So they brought in a new production designer, Harold Michelson, and he upgraded everything to the way that we're used to it looking now. And they also had a special effects company called Robert Abel and Associates. Abel was this guy who had produced some really famous TV commercials in the 70s. Probably people who were around in the 70s would remember this amazing 7-Up commercial where a woman transformed into a butterfly. That was his. And his most famous commercial was this thing called the Little Trademark, and it was a Levi's jeans trademark, the little sticker on the back of the pants that someone put on a leash and takes for a walk through this psychedelic neighborhood. So the visual effects in those commercials were great. Douglas Trumbull was approached and did not want anything to do with Star Trek. John Dykstra was approached, and he was busy working on Altered States at the time, which he eventually got released from. So they decided to go with this guy, Bob Abel. Now, the thing about Bob Abel is he was a real visionary, talented guy, but he never did anything on schedule or on budget. And So Paramount said something like, he said, how much will the visual effects cost? He gave them a bid for $4 million. This was like January of 1978, and by the summer of 78, that number had gone up to about $12 million. So all of this was kind of happening, and finally Paramount said, look, we got all these people under contract. We can't keep reworking stuff. We've got to get shooting. So the movie started shooting in August of 1978 with an incomplete script. They were building sets as they went along. As you know, all that kind of stuff is going to make a budget go higher and higher. But so they began the shoot. The shoot itself with the cast and Robert Weiss went fairly smoothly, except for that every day they'd be getting new pages. Harold Livingston would do a rewrite, and then Gene Roddenberry would rewrite Harold Livingston, and then Harold Livingston would find out, and he would rewrite Gene Roddenberry, and basically nobody knew what they were shooting from day to day. And Robert Weiss, who at that point had made like 40-something movies, was famous for saying, in all my years in movies, I've never been in a situation like this before. So that was going on. And so the shoot was rough from that point of view. Apparently it all went well with the actors for the most part. They had to get Leonard Nimoy on board because Leonard Nimoy originally was not going to be in the second television series, basically because Gene Roddenberry didn't like him. So he offered him a pretty bad deal. He could only be in 2 episodes out of every 12 or 13 or whatever it was. And so, Leonard told him, no, I won't do it. He also was suing Paramount because Paramount was doing a lot of licensing of Star Trek stuff in the early 70s and not paying any of the actors. So Leonard had this lawsuit going on. He didn't like Roddenberry, and the original script did not have Mr. Spock in it. Because it was the pilot for the show that wasn't going to have Spock in it. They had a new character, a character named Zahn, who was a full Vulcan, and he was going to be played by an actor called David Gautreaux. And Gautreaux ends up, he's the guy in the motion picture, he's the commander of the space station that gets blown up at the beginning of the movie. So he ended up not being Zahn. So all that was going on, and Paramount finally got Leonard, because Robert Weiss didn't actually know much about Star Trek, but his wife was a big Star Trek fan. And she read the script and she said, you can't do a Star Trek movie without Mr. Spock. So Robert Weiss made one of the conditions of his taking the job that you got to get Leonard. So Leonard ended up getting, like, all of his lawsuit was settled. He got a bunch of money. He got all of his other objections satisfied. But then they had to kind of write Spock into the script. And Gene's idea was to give Spock a nervous breakdown, and then he would have to recover from the nervous breakdown as the adventure went on. And Leonard said, I'm not going to do that. So they came up with the subplot that's in the movie now, where he's gone to Vulcan to get rid of all of his emotions, and when that doesn't work, he joins the Enterprise on their mission. So all that was going on. And then the movie wrapped in probably the end of 1978. They had 1 year, because it was booked into theaters for December 7th, 1979. So they had a year. And at that point, Robert Weiss, the whole summer and into the fall, Robert Abel, the special effects guy, kept showing everybody great designs and concepts and all these great effects he was going to do, but he didn't produce a foot of film. And finally, as they were getting into the new year, Robert Weiss said, I need to see some film. I need to see what you guys are doing. And apparently, there was about 45 seconds of completed footage. And the rumor has it that the footage was so bad that Robert Weiss fired Robert Abel on the spot. The actual transition took a little longer, but now Paramount was in a bind because the movie was booked into theaters for December 7th, and they took all this advance money for it. Plus, they had all this merchandising tied in. So basically, the movie had to come out on that day. and you can't, especially in those days, in the photochemical days, you couldn't start a big effects movie like that in January and expect to be in theaters in December. But that's what they had to do. So Douglas Trumbull was offered a lot of money and other perks to come back, and the workload was so overwhelming that he brought his company in, and then he went and brought John Dykstra's company in, and Dykstra at that point was no longer working on Altered States. So the effects started in January of 79, and really they didn't start shooting film until April of 79, and it was basically the two best special effects companies in the world working around the clock every day without a break from April until about a week before the film went into theaters. And in the process spent about $20 million on the visual effects. So it was crazy.
That is incredible. That really is. And you can just imagine the God, those guys must have been tired.
Yes, Doug Trumbull actually ended up in the hospital after it was over. Yeah, he was exhausted. So yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah, I know that with you were speaking of the budget. That for a time,
yes.
I'm sure that's been surpassed. But there was a time when it held the Guinness Book of World Records record as being the most expensive film ever made. Actually.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. Well, the cost at the time of release was about $45 million. The most expensive movie prior to that was the Dino De Laurentiis King Kong, which was $25 million. So this movie was $20 million more than that. Now, in the defense of the production, a lot of that money was all of the money from the earlier versions of the movie, all of the development money, all of the money from the TV show that didn't go. So not all of that money was spent on the actual film, but an awful lot of that money was spent on the actual film. So it wasn't quite as expensive as the number makes it seem, but it was still a really expensive movie.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember that, and of course the press they latched on to the fact of how expensive it was, and that turned into a whole other thing.
Yeah. Well, that was the era of the big budget. Movies getting out of control, like Close Encounters had gone way over, and then 1941, Spielberg's follow-up, which came out right in the same month as Star Trek, that had gone incredibly over schedule and over budget. The Blues Brothers did, which came out a little bit after, and then of course the end of the following year is when Heaven's Gate came out, and that was another one of those big budget runaway movies which destroyed United Artists. So that was the end of that for a while, the overspending kind of thing.
Yeah, except in the case of Star Trek, I think that it turned a fairly healthy profit. It wasn't a failure by any stretch of the imagination. Right.
It grossed about, I think it was about $150 million domestic, which in those days was phenomenal. The thing the studio was unhappy with is the movie cost so much that it was profitable, but it was nowhere near as profitable as they had hoped it would be for them. It grossed very well. It wasn't particularly profitable.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, it's I know they were a little skittish to do the second one, which, of course, the budget was scaled way back for that one, we all know. So,
yep. Scale for the second one was $11 million, so basically 1/4 of what the motion picture was.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what were some of the technical challenges, if you have any stories about those, if you have any specific incidences, and if not, we can move on to another subject.
Right. Well, there was a number of them. In the actual filming on the bridge of the Enterprise, which is where most of the movie takes place, most of the actors are, the set was a double-level set, and it was buttoned up, meaning that they built the set for the TV show. There was open walls, so they could kind of move in and shoot from different angles. The cinematographer on Star Trek: The Motion Picture was Richard Klein, who Robert Weiss had worked with on the Andromeda Strain. And his feeling was that he wanted it to look real, and his thought was the way to make it look real was to make it real. So he ordered the set sealed. So the idea being that they would have to put cameras in a place that you could only put them if they were filming in a real set, in a real location. So that added a great deal of realism to the set, but at the same time, it made it really challenging to shoot a lot of what they had to shoot because there's a lot of action and stuff going on and not quite as many available angles as they would like. So that was very challenging. Another thing that was challenging was all of the view screens on the bridge, and there were a lot of view screens, were back projection units. All of them had 16 millimeter projectors built into the cabinets behind them. So anytime you see any kind of information on the view screens, you imagine 30 16 millimeter projectors clacking away while you're filming a shot, and you can get a sense of the noise. So almost all of the dialogue had to be post-dubbed. So that was a big issue. To make the screens visible, they had to shoot at a very low light level. They couldn't overlight the Enterprise. So Weiss and Klein decided to make it like the bridge of a submarine. So they shot at very, very low light levels so that the images would pop out from the screens. But when you do that, you don't get any depth of field. So if you look carefully at the bridge, Richard Klein was a master of using what they call split field diopters. And those are things where you can focus half the picture and then focus the other half in a different plane. So if you look really closely at quite a few of the shots on the bridge of the Enterprise, they're shot with split field diopters. That was the only way they could get the image. So all of that was pretty complicated for those guys. Also, for the visual effects, Robert Abel was shooting 65 millimeter, so they had to bring a lot of 65 millimeter cameras onto the set. They would shoot a scene the way they wanted in 35 millimeter, and then would often have to reshoot it many, many times with the 65 millimeter as well. So simple scenes would often take days and days and days to shoot just because it had to be shot so much. So much footage had to be filmed.
Wow, those are some really I can't imagine. That's very daunting to think about that. But in the analog era, I mean, things took a lot longer, and it's a pretty amazing accomplishment when you think about all of those things that they had, the obstacles they had to find ways to overcome.
Well, it's a gorgeous looking movie, all that work paid off, but it was torturous. So.
Yeah, I think the technicians probably were definitely in need of some R&R when it was all over. I'm sure.
Yes, for sure.
So, I was going to get into the post-production phase of the film and ask a few questions about that, because I know they were pretty much working on it right up until the last minute, from what I understand.
Yeah. Well, the famous story is that the premiere was held, and I forget the date, but it was only a couple days before December 7th. So let's say December 4th or 5th or something. And the premiere was held at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and Robert Weiss famously brought the last 2 reels of the movie with him on the plane because they had just gotten out of the lab. Like they literally were still wet. You hear that a lot. Oh, the print was still wet. These literally were still wet. That's how close they pulled it. The post-production the big drama of the post-production was the visual effects. As I said, they basically fired Robert Abel at the end of 1978 and brought Doug, and they kind of, it's a little complicated, not probably worth going into, but the firing was in a couple of stages. So they originally, there were several kinds of shots. There were optical shots and animation shots and then model shots. And so basically, initially they took the model shots away from Abel, and then eventually they took the whole thing away from Abel. And that would have been sometime around end of February, March of 79. So Doug Trumbull really only got going in full capacity on the picture in April. So it was really a lot of around-the-clock work from the visual effects companies. John Dykstra's company, which was where the original effects for Star Wars were done, the original ILM, which was in Van Nuys, California, out by the airport, they became Apogee. So they were working out in Van Nuys around the clock, and Doug Trumbull's company was called Future General, and that was down in Marina del Rey, which, if you know Los Angeles, you couldn't really get further apart in the city of Los Angeles than those two places. So they were literally on the other side of the city from one another. Trumbull's group shot everything with the Enterprise and everything with the V'ger cloud that threatens them. John Dykstra's company shot the Klingon stuff, and he shot the exterior of V'ger, and then Trumbull's group shot the interior of V'ger. So again, all of this was going on, a lot of experimentation. Basically, they used all the same teams from Close Encounters and from Star Wars for the most part. So if they basically used the techniques that they developed, because that was the only way they could get the thing going. They didn't have a whole lot of time to do other things, but even so, the experimentation was intense and ongoing. And the film is really interesting when you look at it. Some of the effects are as breathtaking as anything you'll ever see. All of the stuff with the Enterprise in dry dock and much of it out in space is just beautiful. And then there are some things, like when they're on Vulcan, some of the matte paintings they don't particularly work, and some of the effects, there's famously, as the Enterprise comes out of dry dock, if you look closely, you can see the stand the Enterprise is held on, because they just didn't have time to paint everything out. But overall, the work was really incredible, especially when you think to yourself it was done in about 6 months. Both Star Wars and Close Encounters took 18 months, and Star Trek had more effect shots in it than either of those two films. So from that point of view, it was really incredible that they pulled off. And if there are flaws in the movie, they're very easy to forgive when you understand the conditions that it was being filmed under.
Sure.
Yeah, and the other thing they had to do was there was a thing they called the memory wall. In the movie, there's a sequence where Spock goes out of the Enterprise to make contact with V'ger, which was the living machine. And in the original way they were going to do it, they had a thing called a memory wall, where it was basically a bunch of glass cubes that they could project images on, and you would see all of the journey and the memories and the experiences that V'ger had on its way to Earth. And the story was Spock would go into V'ger, find this memory wall, mind meld with it to understand what was going on, and then it would attack him. And Kirk had to come after him and rescue him, and then they go back to the ship. But the memory wall was this big impractical set, and they had stunt doubles for Nimoy and Shatner on wires, and it just wasn't working. So Doug Trumbull came up with this idea to essentially do a version of the Stargate sequence, where from 2001, where Spock would go through and just see all of these abstract images that would represent V'ger's journey. So he actually got Robert Weiss's permission to design and direct that sequence himself. So that's all Doug Trumbull. Spock's whole spacewalk is all Doug Trumbull. That happened in post-production. The other thing that was a big deal in post was that Paramount had an order, basically, which was the film could not be any more than 2 hours and 10 minutes long without credit, because with the movie costing what it did, They wanted to make sure they could get as many shows in a day as possible. And if it was any longer than that, they would lose a show for each theater. And so Paramount had this mandate that the movie could not be any longer than that. So when they were editing the movie together, Todd Ramsey was the editor with Bob Weiss, who was an editor himself, as hopefully everybody knows. He's the guy who cut Citizen Kane, among other things. They were putting this movie together, but they didn't have any of the effects because the effects weren't done until really late in the game. So they were kind of guessing at the length of things and all that. And basically when the effects finally started to come in the last 2 months or so, because Paramount had this time limit, in order to put the effects in, they had to cut out some of the drama and the character moments. And that ended up making the actors pretty angry because Leonard Nimoy felt that most of Spock's characterization was cut out of the release. But they couldn't go past this thing that Paramount had said, and they had no way of judging the effects. So they finally, and also Paramount was paying all this money for effects, and they wanted to see it. So they weren't really allowed to trim it. So that's why, famously the movie is nicknamed the motionless picture by some people, because some of the effect sequences just go on and on and on. And that's because of this. So that was the other big thing. And then they couldn't get Jerry Goldsmith started on the score because he didn't have a movie to score until really late in the game. And famously, he conducted the last piece of music for the movie at 5 a.m. on Saturday, and I believe the premiere was Monday. So that's how quickly that went together. So, yeah,
that's incredible. Yeah, he was known to be he was a master at working under the gun, famously for Chinatown, of course, among many others.
Yep.
When he could churn them out really quickly. So yeah, he had a real knack for that sort of thing. So he was definitely the man for the job in that case.
Absolutely, and his work is the one thing nobody argues about in that movie because it's pretty terrific.
Oh, it's astounding. I totally agree. It's right up there with the best of Goldsmith's work in his entire career,
yep.
I would say. So, yeah. Well, I just wanted to get into a little bit about the various cuts of the film because I know there are several cuts, at least 2 we know of, and maybe more.
Right. Well, the theatrical, the one that was released in theaters in '79, was that preview. That print was never previewed. They didn't have the time, and Robert Weiss felt that basically they were releasing a rough cut because, as we talked about, many of the visual effects scenes go on too long. Some character moments are missing. He never got a chance to do a fine-tuned edit on it. But Paramount really had to get this thing into theaters, and the famous Barry Diller line was that Doug Trumbull and Robert Weiss went to Barry Diller at one point and said, we know you want this movie out at Christmas, but if you push it to April, we're going to give you like a much better movie. And Diller's famous comment was, I don't care if I have to release 2 hours of blank leader on December 7th. This movie is coming out on December 7th. So they didn't get that. Yeah. So the movie came out, and it was the movie everybody remembers who saw it in the theater. So that was the first cut of it. There was some talk, because films in those days were released in Europe months after the United States. So there was some talk about Robert Weiss going in and doing re-edit, but that never happened. And also in those days, movies were re-released. Usually about 18 months after the original release, and there was talk then of recutting the film and releasing it in a 70 millimeter print. Unlike most of the big movies of that era, Star Trek was not released in 70 millimeter at any point. And then none of that happened. So basically, the movie was what it was. And then in the early 80s, it went on to ABC television. It was their Sunday night movie. And I remember having this experience, and I've heard many people did. I had very mixed feelings about the movie when I saw it in the theater. I thought it had a lot of problems. And when I watched it on ABC, I almost didn't watch it because I was like, I didn't particularly love that film. And as I was watching, I was like, wow, this is much better than I remember it being. And as it turns out, without Robert Weiss's participation, Paramount had added in a lot of the character stuff that had been cut out for the theatrical release, because if ABC would give them more money if they could program it into a 3-hour slot rather than a 2-hour slot, which was the usual. So Paramount padded the movie with these scenes, and all of a sudden it was a much, much better movie. That is called the ABC print. Then home video got started in the early 80s. So the original release of Star Trek The Motion Picture on home video is the ABC print. It's the one with, and it was advertised as 6 extra minutes of footage. But that 6 extra minutes was all the character and narrative material. So that was if you watched the movie on VHS, that was the version you were seeing. And that was the one that went out on early DVD. And then around 2000, Paramount was talking about doing like special editions, upgrading, putting special features on and all that kind of stuff for DVD. And through a combination of circumstances, Robert Weiss was given the opportunity to go back in and re-edit the movie the way he wanted it, finally. He was initially a little reluctant to do that, but eventually came around. And also special effects teams were hired, and there were some visual effects that were intended to be made for the film to clarify some story points that were never completed. And so a company was hired, and some effects were created, mostly digitally, to put those effects in the movie. And the most famous one is at the end of the film, the Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy and the rest go out on the hull of the Enterprise, and they're going to walk over to where the V'ger brain center is. In the movie, they just walk on this solid surface. But the original intention of the visual effects was that there was going to be no bridge at all, and then these sort of magical illuminated shapes, really, they don't really have a name for them, would sort of land and create a bridge from the hull to the V'ger. So they did that. That's the most famous edition in the home video version. They also they recreated Vulcan so that the visual effects there made it a much more believable planet. So they did a lot of nice additional work. And they also created an image of V'ger at the end, because in the actual theatrical release, you never see the thing. You really see bits and pieces of it, but you never see the entire thing. So they created an effect for that. That was the version that came out. It's called the Director's Cut. And Robert Weiss, apparently before he passed away, he said in his mind, that is the version of the movie he considers finished. So he wants that to be considered the official version of the film. And the controversy about that is that Paramount provided money for those effects to be created for DVD quality, but those effects are not high quality enough for Blu-ray or a new print of the film. The elements all exist for that, but Paramount has never shown interest in paying to have them upgraded. So when you buy the film on Blu-ray, you are buying the 1979 theatrical version.
Yeah, and that's really sad too, because I know a lot of fans would love to see, including myself, would love to see the Robert Wise approved version, and I just can't. Exactly. I can't imagine why they would think that it wouldn't work financially, with Star Trek being such a cash cow. I'm pretty sure that they would at least break even, you would think.
I would think, but I've heard some different stories, and Paramount has a very weird relationship with Star Trek. It is one of their big franchises. It's actually the movie series that coined the term franchise. It was originally a joke that Paramount used to refer to it as the franchise. It was never meant to be taken seriously. But what's weird is that there are times they are very willing to exploit it, but there are other times, like if you get a box set of the Star Trek movies, let's say, or even the Star Trek television show, the extras are mostly very spotty and very sort of haphazard and sloppy. Some of them are quite good, and then some of them are just very lazy. And considering that that's its really big cash cow, I'm just really surprised Paramount hasn't really invested in it all a lot more. But I guess they feel they don't have to. I don't know. I'm not really sure what the thinking is. But the studio has always had a really weird relationship with that property. So maybe an administration will come along that thinks more highly of it. We'll have to see, you know.
Yeah, we could certainly hope, I would say. And in the meantime, we would recommend all of our listeners to hold on to your DVD copies of Star Trek the Motion Picture, the Director's Cut.
Yep. Don't get rid of it.
That's right. I still have one proudly in my collection, that's for sure, and I wouldn't part with it for anything. I've had it. I bought it when it came out, and I've had it ever since. And so it's
sure.
Proudly displayed on my shelf. So anyway, well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on to talk about Star Trek the Motion Picture. This has been really awesome. This gives us a really better picture, so to speak, of what went into putting this movie together, of the motion picture, and what went into all the tremendous effort that went into bringing this movie to the big screen and launching, as we said, the franchise, which has really become such a mainstay, for better or worse. That's actually ruling what we see at the box office now. I think it all stems from Star Trek the Motion Picture in some way, I would say.
It actually does. And Robert Weiss and a whole bunch of other people have basically said that had that movie failed at the box office, that would have been the end of Star Trek. So anyone who likes Star Trek and any of the subsequent series, the other movies that were made, the other television shows, The Next Generation and the others, and even the J.J. Abrams versions, and now this new stuff on CBS streaming, none of that probably would have ever happened had the motion picture not been a success. And it's not a perfect movie. It's got a lot of flaws in it, but it has many great things in it too. And I have always maintained that it's the one Star Trek movie out of the original 10 prior to the J.J. Abrams that actually looks like a movie. I love a lot of the other ones quite a bit, but they all look like television shows. That one looks like a motion picture. So I don't think the Enterprise has ever looked better. So I think it has that to recommend it for sure.